The overnight shift at Red Pine Diner is usually quiet. It sits just off the highway, with barely any cars passing by after midnight. I like the peace, though. It's an easy job. Keep the coffee fresh, clean the tables, and make sure nobody skips out on their tab. Really, it's no big deal. Around 2 a.m., the bell over the door gave a faint jingle. A woman walked in, and I could tell something was off. She wore a bright red coat but no shoes. Her feet were dirty, leaving wet prints across the floor. Her long, dark hair dripped water onto her shoulders, but it wasn't raining outside. She slid into the nearest booth, her face blank, like she wasn't all there. When I walked over, she gave me a tired look and said softly,
"Just coffee. Black."
I nodded and got her order. When I set the cup down in front of her, she wrapped her hands around it like she'd been freezing. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to be friendly. She didn't respond, just stared into her cup like it held some kind of secret. After a few minutes, she took out a small piece of paper, folded it, and placed it on the counter. Then, she stood up and left without another word, leaving her coffee untouched. I called out, but she didn't turn back. Just drifted out the door, bare feet slapping the pavement. Curious, I picked up the note she'd left behind. All it said was, "See you soon." The next hour was slow, just me wiping down tables and watching the coffee pot simmer. The smell of stale eggs filled the air, a reminder of the breakfast rush that wouldn't come for hours. I tried to shake off the strange feeling the woman had left with me, but it clung to the air like humidity. At exactly 3 a.m., the bell over the door jingled again. I looked up, and there she was. The same woman in the red coat, still barefoot, still soaked. She took the same seat in the same booth and asked for black coffee again, as if it was the first time. I felt my stomach twist. "Hey, you were just here," I said, hoping for an explanation. She looked up at me with the same empty expression.
"Just coffee."
I brought her the cup, my hands shaky this time. She cradled it like before, staring into it with the same blank look. I glanced at the door, wondering if maybe I had dreamed the earlier encounter, but the damp footprints on the floor said otherwise. They hadn't dried yet. She reached into her coat, pulled out another folded note, and left it on the counter. Then she got up and drifted back outside without touching her coffee. I grabbed the note, hoping for something, anything, to make sense of this. But it read the same as the last one. "See you soon." I stood there, clutching the paper, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest. The diner was still. Outside, the highway stretched on, dark and empty. When 4 a.m. came around, I half expected the bell to ring again. And I wasn't wrong. It did. It was her. The woman in the red coat, barefoot and soaking wet. She walked in as if nothing strange had happened and slid into the same booth. My pulse quickened, but I tried to keep it together.
"Just coffee. Black."
Her voice was soft, like a lullaby that didn't quite sit right. I stared at her, searching her face for any hint of recognition. "You've been here already. Twice." I didn't know why I said it. I just needed her to acknowledge it. But her expression didn't change. It was like talking to someone in a dream. I placed the coffee in front of her, and just like before, she wrapped her hands around the cup. She sat quietly, gazing into the black liquid. I held my breath, waiting for her next move. I didn't have to wait long. After a minute, she pulled out another folded note, placed it on the counter, and drifted out the door. I grabbed the note the second she left, unfolding it with shaky hands. It was exactly the same as the previous two. It read, "See you soon." 5 a.m. I sat behind the counter, hands gripping my knees, trying to make sense of what was happening. I thought about calling someone, maybe the sheriff's office. But what would I even say? A barefoot woman keeps showing up and ordering coffee on repeat? I could already hear them laughing. The bell rang again, and my stomach twisted. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was, but something inside me still hoped I was wrong. I glanced up. There she was. Red coat, bare feet, soaked to the bone. She didn't hesitate, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge me. She slid into the booth like she had every time before. I stood up, my hands trembling. What the hell is going on? My voice came out harsher than I intended, but I was too rattled to care.
Just coffee. Black.
As usual, she ordered like she hadn't even heard me. I stared at her for a long moment, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I was losing it. I knew I was. But I made the coffee anyway, setting it down in front of her. Same as before, she didn't drink it. She just sat there, cradling the cup like it was the only thing keeping her together. This time, I didn't wait. The second she placed the note on the counter, I grabbed her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. I half expected her to scream, but she didn't even flinch. She looked at me with those blank eyes and said in the same quiet voice,
See you soon.
Then she slipped free from my grip, left the note on the counter, and walked out into the night. When the bell rang again at 6 a.m., I almost didn't look up. My hands were sweaty and my heart thundering like a drum. I knew exactly who it was, but this time, something was different. She sat down in the booth, as usual, but her coat wasn't red anymore. It was a dull, dusty brown, like it had been hanging in a closet for years. The wet footprints she left behind were gone too. Her feet were clean now, dry. She looked the same otherwise, but these little changes sent a chill through me.
Coffee?
She asked, her voice soft and familiar. But she didn't ask for it black. What kind of coffee? I managed to stammer. She looked confused, like she hadn't expected me to ask. She repeated after a pause.
Black coffee. Like always.
I made the coffee, my hands fumbling with the cup. As I set it down, the room felt off, as if the diner was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She reached into her coat. This time, it wasn't a folded note she pulled out. It was a key. She placed it gently on the counter, looked me dead in the eyes, and whispered,
You'll need this soon.
Before I could say anything, she slid out of the booth and left. The bell jingled, and she was gone. I stared at the key sitting on the counter. It was old, brass, and heavy. There was no tag, no label, nothing to indicate what it opened. But for the first time that night, I was truly afraid. I couldn't stop staring at the key. It was cold and heavier than it looked, as if it belonged to something ancient, something important. But what could it unlock? My hands shook as I tucked it into my pocket, feeling its weight press against me like a bad omen. The clock on the wall ticked towards 7 a.m., and my nerves tightened. I didn't want to hear the bell jingle again. I didn't want her to come back. But the bell rang anyway. This time, the diner didn't feel right. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting odd shadows across the room. Everything smelled different, like the air had gone stale, like the place hadn't been open for years. The coffee machine, which I had cleaned earlier, looked rusted. A help wanted sign now sat crooked on the front window. I didn't remember seeing it before. And there she was again. The woman in the dull brown coat stepped inside, but something about her was off this time. Her hair looked longer, messier, and streaked with gray. Her eyes were sharper, like they knew something I didn't. She wasn't just repeating the same behavior anymore. She gave me a strange smile as she sat down in her usual booth and said quietly,
I've been wondering how long it would take.
I froze. She had never spoken like this before. It was like she knew me. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. She said, her voice soft but unsettling.
You'll remember soon enough. They always do.
Before I could respond, she reached into her coat again, but this time she didn't pull out a note or a key. She took out an old photograph and slid it across the counter toward me. The picture showed the diner, but it was abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the sign out front was cracked and falling apart. Standing in the doorway was me, older, tired, with the same hollow expression the woman wore. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my throat tightening. She just smiled.
It's your last shift.
The bell above the door jingled again. This time I felt a cold wave wash over me. I looked up, expecting another customer, but the door was empty. No one had come in. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. Her seat was empty, and the coffee cup was untouched, just like all the times before. I stood there, my heart pounding. I glanced at the clock. It was still 7 a.m., but the second hand wasn't moving. Time had stopped. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle. Like footsteps, but heavier, slower. The kind of sound someone makes when they drag one foot behind them. I turned toward the noise, and that's when I saw it. Something was sitting at the counter, right where I had just been. It was me, or at least something that looked like me. It wore the same uniform, sat slumped over with its elbows on the counter, staring down at a cup of coffee. But the version of me in the seat looked older, almost withered, like it had been stuck there for years. My chest tightened, and my skin felt cold. This couldn't be real. I took a step back, and the thing at the counter slowly lifted its head. It smiled. My smile. But twisted, like it knew something terrible that I didn't. The bell jingled again. I spun toward the door. The woman was back. She stood there, still in her brown coat, her eyes sharp and empty.
It's almost time. You can't leave without the key.
Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and felt the cold brass key. "What does it unlock?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. Her smile didn't reach her eyes.
You'll see soon.
The diner began to change around me. Tables disappeared, walls warped, and the windows flickered between being boarded up and crystal clear. I looked back at the counter. The older version of me was still there, watching, waiting. Then the clock on the wall gave a loud, hollow tick. Time was moving again. And I knew, deep down, that I didn't have much of it left. 8 a.m. was coming. And with it, the end of something, or someone. I leaned against the counter, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The walls of the diner flickered between states. 1 second, it was clean and intact. The next, it looked old and crumbling, with dusty tables and peeling wallpaper. I couldn't tell which version was real. I clutched the brass key in my hand, its cold weight grounding me in the moment. The woman's last words echoed in my mind. "You can't leave without the key." Then I noticed it. The mirror. It was sitting behind the counter, mounted on the wall. I knew it wasn't there before, but now it gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights like it had always been part of the diner. I stepped closer, heart pounding. My reflection stared back, but something was wrong. The man in the mirror wasn't moving with me. I leaned forward, but the reflection stood still, its head tilted slightly to the side, eyes narrowing with something between curiosity and amusement. Then it smiled my smile, but warped and wrong, like a mask that didn't fit quite right. I stumbled back, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The mirror version of me lifted a hand and waved slowly, as if taunting me. but I wasn't moving at all. And then, with deliberate slowness, it mouthed 2 words. Almost time. The bell above the door jingled again. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. But this time, I knew I wouldn't find the woman standing there. Something worse was coming. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating like a storm on the horizon. I glanced toward the door and saw nothing. But when I looked back toward the mirror, the man inside it was gone. My reflection was empty, as if the mirror had swallowed it whole. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging its nails along wood. The sound came from behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. The older version of me, the one I had seen slumped at the counter earlier, was standing in the middle of the diner. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that sucked in the light, and its twisted smile stretched impossibly wide across its face. It dragged 1 foot behind it, just like before, moving closer. The same uniform hung loosely on its withered frame, but now it was stained with something dark. Coffee or maybe blood. "Who the hell are you?" I whispered, taking a step back. My voice cracked under the weight of fear. It tilted its head, still smiling. "You already know." It whispered in a voice identical to mine, only slower and deeper, like a tape being played in reverse. I bolted toward the door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. The lock clicked, over and over, as if the door wanted to let me out but couldn't. I yanked harder, panic setting in. The bell above the door jingled. Not from me moving it, but on its own. I looked up in time to see the woman in the brown coat step through the door one last time. But this time, her eyes were pure white, glowing faintly in the dim light.
"It's time,"
she whispered. Her presence was suffocating, like standing in the eye of a storm that was about to swallow everything whole. I backed away, my chest tightening with fear. With calm and patience in her voice, she said,
"The key. It only works if you accept it."
"What does that mean?" I shouted. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the counter, picked up a coffee cup, and handed it to me. Inside was the key I thought I had in my pocket. I looked down at the identical key in my hand and watched it dissolve into smoke. The older version of me shuffled closer, just a few feet away now. Its empty eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I knew then, if it touched me, I would become it.
"Use the key,"
the woman said softly, almost tenderly. I stared at the key in my hand, heart racing. I had no idea what it unlocked, no idea if using it would save me or doom me. The thing wearing my face reached out, its fingers inches from my throat. I could feel the cold radiating from its skin. With a scream, I jammed the key into the lock on the door and turned it. The lights flickered violently, plunging the diner into total darkness for a split second. When they came back on, everything was still. The woman was gone. The older version of me was gone. The diner was exactly as it should be. Clean, quiet, and intact. I stumbled back from the door, gasping for breath. The clock on the wall ticked normally now, the second hand moving steadily. I glanced at the counter. The coffee cup sat there, empty, no note or key in sight. For a moment, I thought it was over. And then I heard the bell jingle one last time. The bell jingled softly, and I froze, dread creeping into my bones. The diner was empty, or at least it looked that way. I didn't want to turn around, but something deep inside told me I had to. Slowly, I turned toward the door. It was me. Another version of me stood there, just outside the entrance, staring back with lifeless eyes. He wore the same uniform I was wearing, only stained and tattered, as if he'd been working here forever. His skin was pale, and he was grinning. That same twisted, unnatural smile. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the counter, heart pounding so hard I thought my ribs would crack. This was the end. I could feel it. Somehow, everything had led me to this moment. Come on. The other version of me whispered through the glass, his voice extremely slowed. It's time to clock out. The bell jingled again, and the door swung open on its own. The diner shifted around me. Walls flickered, tables warped, and the hum of the coffee machine distorted into a low, droning sound. The highway outside was gone. In its place was a thick forest, black trees swaying in the windless air. I reached for the key still clutched in my hand, hoping it would do something. Anything. But before I could act, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside with my doppelganger. He shuffled closer, dragging one foot like the thing I'd seen in the mirror earlier. His grin stretched wider, unnatural and hungry. The air grew colder, and I could feel something shifting inside me. Like time was running out, like I was about to become him. Suddenly, the woman in the brown coat appeared again, standing behind the counter. She gave me a sad, knowing look. She whispered,
This is where it always ends, and where it begins again.
I stared at her, desperate for answers. What the hell is this? Why me? She tilted her head, her white eyes gleaming in the flickering light.
The diner only opens for the lost. You've been here before, and you'll be here again.
I shook my head, backing away from the grinning version of me creeping closer. I don't belong here, I shouted. She smiled. The same cold, lifeless smile I had seen in the mirror.
You'll remember soon. They always do.
With no other choice, I jammed the brass key into the lock on the door again and twisted hard. The diner shuddered, and everything flickered violently. The walls, the booths, even the light above the counter. It was as if reality itself was struggling to stay together. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. The door creaked open. But when I stepped forward, the other version of me grabbed my wrist, his grip icy and unrelenting. You can't leave, he whispered with that same eerie grin. Not until you take my place. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. His cold fingers burned into my skin, and in that moment, I realized what the woman had meant. There was no escape. Someone had to stay. Someone always had to stay. I felt my body weakening, the cold creeping deeper into my bones. Memories flooded my mind, memories of other shifts, other versions of me, working in this diner over and over again, trapped in an endless loop of the same night. Every choice I had made led me here, to this moment. I looked into his hollow eyes and knew he had once been me. And now I was becoming him. No, I shouted, fighting against the pull. I twisted the key harder, desperate to break free. The door opened wider, and I saw the forest outside. Dark, endless, but free. I just had to step through. With one last surge of strength, I yanked my arm free and dove for the door. I felt the cold grip loosen as I fell forward, tumbling out of the diner and into the dark forest. The door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous echo, and everything went silent. I lay on the cold ground, gasping for breath, the weight of the key gone from my hand. When I looked back, the diner was gone. Nothing but trees surrounded me now, their black branches swaying under an invisible wind. For a moment, I thought I was free. But then, in the distance, I heard it. A soft, familiar jingle. The sound of the bell above the diner door. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. I was out, wasn't I? but when I turned, I saw it through the trees. The diner was still there, its neon sign flickering in the dark. The windows were empty, but I knew something was waiting inside. And then I heard her voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable.
See you soon.
I took a step back, realizing the truth too late. There was no escape. I had made it out, but only for now. The loop never ended. It just waited. The forest whispered with the promise of another shift. Another night, another me. And deep down I knew. The bell would ring again. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. If you'd like to support the channel and get exclusive content, consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching.